This is, as Teresa said, joint work with Sam Liao, and it's directly related to some of the stuff that Inge was talking about earlier, about kind of the overexpansion of certain kinds of terms, or at least the worry that certain terms have gotten overexpanded. And so let me start out with, from the bad old days, this tweet from the American Conservative, where they ask the following rhetorical question. There are people with far, far more offensive racial views than Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson. If Trump and Tucker are racists, then what do you call those other people? And you can imagine for yourself what the comment responses to this tweet were like. There's a pretty obvious answer that you may have already formulated for yourself, which is, well, you call them racist too, right? Okay, so we're interested in the worry about the conceptual inflation of racist, this term racist, and related terms, so terms like sexist, homophobic, and so on. And one question that I have that maybe we can talk about in the discussion section is whether there's a good name for this kind of category of expressions. This was one of the first difficulties that we had when we were thinking about this, was just trying to name these things. So we tried out a couple different options, and we settled on what we think is not completely happy, but the best we could do, expressions condemning oppression. So that's what we've named these variety of expressions like racist and sexist. And so there's worries that have arisen in different areas. So both in sociology, philosophy of race, and popular writing about race by philosophers, that there's something about these terms, especially racist, that is being overextended or overinflated. And what's interesting is that this charge comes not just from the political right, but also roughly the political left. And so here's a passage from Blum, a theorist of race, writing about the overinflation of racists. So I'll just read this quote out. So he says, a major reason for what Robert Miles calls the conceptual inflation, to which the idea of racism has been subject, is its having become the central or even only notion used to mark morally suspect behavior, attitude, and social practice regarding race. The result, either something is racist or it is morally in the clear. If our only choices are to label an act racist or nothing to get too upset about, those who seek to garner moral attention to some racial malfeasance will be tempted to call it racist. That overuse in turn feeds a diminishing of racism's moral force, and thus contributes to weakened concern about racism and other racial ills. So here's an expression of this idea that as the term expands, its moral force and possibly descriptive power is weakened. So we want to start by distinguishing kind of two flavors of this charge of conceptual inflation that you see people making in different places. So there's a descriptivist version of the charge of conceptual inflation, which is that the use of a term by some group has expanded relative to its conventional meaning. And so they're, in some sense, misapplying this term relative to its conventional meaning. And then there's a prescriptivist version of this charge, which is that the use of a term by some group has expanded too much relative to the meaning it should have, where that could potentially float free of whatever the conventional meaning of the term is. So you might, you might think in the spirit of, conceptual engineering that there's some preferred meaning that this term should have, and you're going to criticize people for diverging from the meaning that that the term should have. And then what we're most interested in is a way that this descriptivist claim and this prescriptivist claim get kind of mashed together in a view that we call meaning conservatism. And this isn't related to, this needn't be any kind of political commitment. It's a view about the way that we should be using our expressions. And so here's some elements of meaning conservatism. So the use of a term should conform with the term's actual conventional meaning. So basically you're making these observations about what the actual conventional meaning of the term is, and then saying that the way that people talk should conform with that conventional meaning. So people are diverging from it. And so in this debate about conceptual inflation of racist and sexist, there's this assumption that some contemporary uses of terms like racist diverge from those terms' conventional meaning, where that conventional meaning is narrow in some sense that we'll try to specify. And they think that's bad because using it with the wide meaning diminishes its moral force or descriptive utility, as we saw in that quote from Bloom. So here's what Sam and I were interested in. Is that assumption true? Can we make any sense of this idea of narrow versus wide meanings in these terms, and think about whether, if these terms have a wide meaning, if that means that their moral force is in some way diminished? So we need to do some work making precise what it means to have a narrow or a wide meaning in these terms like racist and sexist. And so here's a little preview of what we're going to argue. So the conventional meaning of these terms, we think there's evidence that the conventional meaning is wide, but we have linguistic resources to modify these expressions, in particular expressing to what degree and along which dimensions the targeted object is racist or sexist and so on. And so the modified forms of these terms still allow us to express nuanced moral appraisals, even if the conventional meaning of the terms turns out to be wide in the relevant sense. Okay, so how are we going to try to establish this? Well, we're going to, Teresa mentioned that, so I'm doing some work on contemporary ordinary language philosophy. In a sense, this is an aspect of a kind of ordinary language approach to this question, which is just trying to figure out what the kind of ordinary meaning of these terms is. And so one technique for doing that is looking at large linguistic corpora and just looking at the diversity of uses that these terms have. And so almost all of the examples that I'm going to be talking about are drawn from the GLOBE corpus. That's the corpus of global web-based English, which is very large, almost 2 billion words. And so just to make a couple observations about looking at this corpus and how these terms are used. So it's clear that racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on are gradable in both their adjective and nominal forms. And so that just means that they can combine with degree modifiers and can appear in comparative construction. So here's a couple examples from the GLOBE corpus. So here's 2 adjective uses and then 2 nominal uses. London is a lot less racist than America. Power Rangers was the most racist show on TV. Here's the nominal uses. Glenn Beck of Fox simply dismissed Woodrow Wilson as a big racist. Joe is a bigger racist than I thought he was. Okay, so gradability. And just an initial reflection on the fact that these are gradable expressions. I should just make a kind of basic claim about the role that these modifiers like extremely or very are playing here. So it seems like we have the resources to say something like being extremely racist or very racist is worse than being slightly racist or kind of racist. And so the conventional meaning of racist and other expressions condemning oppression shows that awareness that racism comes in degrees is already present in everyday discourse. Okay, so thinking about this notion of gradability, we can start to make a little bit more precise what we mean by wide and narrow meanings. So there's a well-known taxonomy of gradable adjectives developed by lots of different theorists, but I was at University of Chicago and talked to Chris Kennedy a lot, so just kind of adopting his and Louise McNally's terminology for these things. So we can distinguish relative gradable adjectives, so expressions like tall and expensive, where the relevant standard on the scale of height or cost can shift depending on the question under discussion or various kinds of contextual features of the conversation that we're in. And relative adjectives contrast with absolute adjectives, where the standard is relatively fixed at one or the other end of the relevant scale. So maximum standard absolute adjectives have a standard that's fixed at the upper end of the relevant scale. So these are expressions like full or flat, closed or straight, where something can be completely full, perfectly flat, completely closed, and so on. And then minimum standard absolute adjectives have a standard that's fixed at the lower end of the relevant scale. So things like spotted or open or bent, where all you need to do to count as being spotted or open or bent is have some degree on the relevant scale that surpasses that minimum standard. Okay, so just a straightforward kind of taxonomic question we can ask, what type of standard does racist and sexist and homophobic and so on have? And so there's various kinds of diagnostics that you can use to try to identify roughly what category these kinds of expressions fall in. So one kind of test is whether the adjective can felicitously combine with the modifier slightly. And so slightly felicitously modifies minimum standard, but not maximum and not relative adjectives. Okay, so here's a table drawn from Globe, the Globe corpus, where you can see the different rates at which this modifier is applied to the relevant adjectives. And so I've just circled here in my red marker that slightly clearly occurs at much higher rates for minimum standard adjectives, bent and bumpy, and occurs very infrequently for maximum standard adjectives like straight and flat, and for relative adjectives like expensive and tall. Okay. And then another diagnostic is whether the terms can combine with the modifier almost. And so almost felicitously modifies maximum standard, but not minimum standard or relative adjectives. And again, you can see the relative rates at which almost occurs with maximum standard adjectives like straight and flat. So you can be almost straight and almost flat, but it sounds weird to say that you're almost expensive or almost tall, except in a kind of metalinguistic sense. Okay, so we can apply these modifiers to these kinds of diagnostics, to racist, sexist, and homophobic in the corpus and see how they pattern. And so when we look at these adjectives and combine them with look for occurrences with slightly and look for occurrences with almost, we can see how they line up. And the way that they line up looks minimum standard. So they do occur with slightly at reasonably high rates, even though the numbers of occurrences here is pretty small, but they occur with almost at much lower rates. And so you don't even find any occurrences of sexist and homophobic being modified with almost in this large corpus. So this looks like a pattern of minimum standard modification for racist, sexist, and homophobic. Okay, so here's one way that we want to try to flesh out this idea that the meaning of these terms is wide. And so this is just that if these are minimum standard, then something's going to count as racist just in case it has a minimal degree of the property that racist picks out, however that is measured. And so that's one way of understanding racist having a wide meaning. So all you have to do is cross this kind of minimum threshold. You don't have to have some extreme degree of the relevant property. And if you think about that initial quote from the American Conservative, the tweet that I read out at the beginning of the talk, the narrow meaning advocates like that statement from the American Conservative seem to assume a maximum standard meaning. So you're only going to count as a racist if you're racist to an extreme degree. So, they're saying if you set the bar too low, it's like you're losing you're kind of lowering the bar too much. You need to put the standard for what counts as racist very high on the relevant scale. Okay, so that's gradability. Now, a second way that we want to talk about kind of wide versus narrow meaning is in terms of multidimensionality. So I was asking this about Inge's talk earlier when she was talking about dual character concepts. But so multidimensionality is the feature that adjectives have when their application depends on multiple dimensions along which orderings of relevant objects can differ, right? So you can say, Tokyo is bigger than New York with respect to population size, but it's also felicitous to say, or at least the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metro region is bigger than Tokyo, Yokohama with respect to geographical size, right? So these two areas, you can order them in different kinds of ways on a scale of bigness. So big is a kind of paradigmatic multidimensional adjectives. And so that contrasts with single dimension adjectives like tall, that don't allow that kind of multiple ordering. So if you're taller than somebody, you're going to be taller than them in all contexts. Sorry, let's see. And so one diagnostic of multidimensional adjectives is that they can be modified by quantification markers, quantifiers such as in some way and in every respect. So the idea is that you can pick out, quantify over these different dimensions that multidimensional adjectives have. So it sounds weird to pick a single dimension adjective like tall and say, he's tall in every respect. That sounds bad. Okay, so we can do this with racist, and we find examples of this in the corpus. So here's some naturally occurring examples. So some people like to make out that Elvis was racist in some ways, presumably, but not in others. Barack Obama, misspelled, is racist in every way. And then, so those are examples of quantifying over these dimensions. And then we can also single out particular dimensions along which something is racist. And again, these are naturally occurring examples in the corpus. So the same thing happens when we say that an action is racist in effect, if not in intention. And this is, this is probably my favorite example to pop out of the corpus. So he's slightly racist, but in an old person type way and not in a hateful type way. Okay, so picking out different dimensions and also degrees, right? So talking about being slightly racist. Okay, so here's a further aspect of types of multidimensionality, and all of this is due to really nice work by Galit Sassoon. And so we can distinguish between disjunctive and conjunctive versions of multidimensional adjectives. So the intuitive way of glossing this is, does an adjective felicitously apply only to objects that meet the relevant standard on all of their dimensions, or to objects that meet the relevant standard on some of their dimensions? So for example, for something to count as healthy, it needs to be healthy in all respects or dimensions. So that's a conjunctive multidimensional adjective. For something to count as sick, it only needs to count as sick in one respect or dimension. That's a disjunctive multidimensional adjective. Okay, and so Galit Sassoon proposes a syntactic test for distinguishing conjunctive and disjunctive multidimensional adjectives. So can it combine with except in its positive form and not in its negative form? Okay, so if it does combine with it in its positive form but not in its negative form, then that's evidence it's conjunctive. If it doesn't do that, that's evidence it's disjunctive. Okay, so I'll give some examples. There's a lot going on here. So she says exception phrases are compatible with universal quantifiers such as every and no, but not with existential ones. So here's some examples, not in the multidimensional realm, but just except phrases combining with explicit quantifiers. So you can say everyone is happy except for Dan. No one is happy except for Dan. But it sounds weird to say that someone is happy except for Dan. Okay. Okay, and so here's this data, I admit, is a little muddy, but I think it generally points in a particular direction. So I'm just going to run through some of these examples, and we can talk about how you feel about these in the discussion. But so here's an example of a conjunctive multidimensional adjective combining with an except phrase. So this is from the Globe corpus. So she was perfectly healthy except for missing one eye. Okay. And then if you try to form the kind of negated version of that, so she wasn't healthy, or not, she wasn't perfectly healthy except for having normal vision, that sounds kind of bad. So it's that pattern of except phrases combining with the positive version and not with the negative version that's characteristic of the conjunctive multidimensional adjective, where you have to satisfy all of the different dimensions of the adjective to count as having the relevant property. Okay, and so sick should pattern in the other kind of way. So there's no examples of finding sick except in the Globe corpus, and it does sound weird to say something like she was sick except for having normal blood pressure. It's not impossible, but it sounds less good than she was perfectly healthy except for missing one eye. And here's what I think is an acceptable version, and it is, I found it on Google, it's not in the Globe corpus, but here's somebody saying, it seemed that Cheeble was not sick except for some weakness. Okay, and so you could take sick, which is a disjunctive multidimensional adjective, and when you put that in a negative context, then it seems like it's okay to use the except phrase. Okay, so with that kind of background, we can ask again, how do racist and sexist pattern? And so let's skip 5 for the time being and go down to 6. So 6 is a naturally occurring example on Google. So he wasn't sexist except for when it came to women in the police force. Okay, that sounds okay to me. I mean, the syntactically okay, not the underlying idea. And then this is my version, this is my negated version of that. Or this is the positive context. So he was sexist except for when it came to women in the police force. And that sounds kind of okay, not quite as good as 6. I'm not sure what people think about that example. I think 7, okay, and these are misnumbered, it should be 7 and 8. I think 7 and 8 are a little bit clearer. So look at the the final 7 at the bottom of the page. This is a naturally occurring example in the Globe corpus. I'm not a racist except for the company I keep. Okay, that sounds fine. But the negated version, or sorry, the positive version of that, I'm a racist except for the company I keep, I think sounds worse. And so what this pattern, if my little kind of acceptability indicators are in the right places here, this looks like a pattern for disjunctive multidimensional adjectives, where you only need to satisfy one of the relevant dimensions to count as having the relevant property. Okay, so I mean, it's a little muddy, but I think it's pointing in a particular direction. And so I think there's some evidence that racist and these other expressions condemning oppression are disjunctive multidimensional adjectives. And so if so, that's another respect in which their meaning is wide. That means they'll felicitously apply to objects just in case they have some degree of the relevant property along one of the many dimensions of these things. Okay, so just to wrap this up, so what's the significance of these observations about the kind of standard way that these expressions are used? So we think that the conventional meaning of racist and sexist and the other expressions condemning oppression is wide. And what we mean by that is that they're minimum standard gradable adjectives and they're disjunctive multidimensional adjectives. And what that means is that we have the linguistic resources to make the meaning of these things as precise as we need them to be. We can specify what relevant degree of the relevant property the target object has and in what dimension it has it. And so it's not as if we're losing some kind of descriptive power by the fact that these terms are wide in the sense that that we've specified. And so what we want to say is that this notion of meaning conservatism often gets made without looking in detail at the way that these expressions are actually used. And so the idea is not that there's some narrow meaning in ordinary use that people are diverging from when they apply these terms widely. We think that the ordinary use of these things is wide. And so, you know, anybody who wants to restrict the meaning of these things to say like extreme degrees of the relevant properties, as in the tweet that we started the presentation with, that they are proposing a revision to the ordinary conventional use of these terms. And you know, this is a conceptual engineering conference, so people are perfectly open to the possibility of assigning new meanings to expressions, or you know, shifting their meaning away from conventional meanings of these things. And so we're happy to consider revisions to the conventional meanings of these terms, but we really await good reasons for doing so. We think that the wideness of the meanings of these expressions doesn't mean they lose their descriptive power or the fact that we can use them to express nuanced moral condemnations. So thank you.